All right, so today I'm going to be talking about birds as indicators of ecological health and kind of applying that canary in the coal mine idea to modern times now. All right, just kind of outline what I'm going to talk about. So first, I'll just give a brief introduction to myself because I think it's important for you to know who I am, kind of where I come from, and what I'm interested in. Then we'll talk about birds as ecological sentinels, just in the big picture. And then I have 3 of my current studies that I'll talk a little bit about. They're a little bit preliminary, so we have some data that I'll be sharing, and some of them are just ones we're just getting started on, but we're excited about. And then I'm going to highlight some of the citizen science opportunities that you guys can get involved in. And I'm sure some of them you already are involved in. You're at a Birding the Border festival, so you're probably pretty up to date. But in case you aren't, there are a few of these that I really want to highlight. And feel free to ask questions throughout. I have been teaching on Zoom all year, so I think I can monitor the chat while I give this presentation. So if you have questions, to type in the chat. If you're online, that's great. If you have a question in the audience and want to ask me during it, I think Maureen can probably handle that, or we can just deal with it afterwards. But feel free to ask questions throughout. I know when we're going through a lot of information, it might be easier to ask questions when they come up to you rather than waiting till the end. Oops, went backwards. There we go. All right. Okay, so first I just want to share a little bit about myself and kind of my research trajectory. So I'm originally from Hawaii, and I lived there till I was 18, and that's really where I fell in love with birds. If any of you have been there, there's lots of really awesome birds that are hard to see in other parts of the United States there. And then I went over to Oregon for my undergraduate degree, and there I was at Willamette University, which is a small liberal arts college. They're actually the first university in the West, and they have a great field biology program. And while I was there, I got to work with Caspian terns. There's the largest colony of Caspian terns in the world. I think it's still the largest in the world. They have about 20,000 birds, so over 10,000 pairs. And it's a man-made site. So there's a lot of research going on there. But what I was really interested in was how the chicks develop prey handling skills. So as you probably know, these guys are plunge divers, and they have to be able to manipulate prey items really well as soon as they fledge in order to feed themselves. So they actually start developing these skills while they're on the colony being fed by their parents. And I was looking at how they learn how to handle prey items. All right, so then after that, I moved on to North Carolina, and I went to Wake Forest University for my PhD, and I was studying Nazca boobies in the Galapagos Islands while I was there. And then I started to get much more interested in physiology and started getting interested in hormones and how hormones are mediating behaviors, how they have developmental effects on birds. After that, I moved over to France for my postdoc. There I was at the Centre d'études biologiques de Gizeh, which is a national center for ecological research in France. And I started studying house sparrows. So I moved over to passerines from seabirds. And I got a lot more interested in physiology, and it's a lot more, passerines are a lot more amenable to that sort of work than seabirds are, at least for experimental designs. It's a lot easier to do them in small birds. And there I was looking at early life stress and how it affects later life immune factors and physiology and behavior as well. All right, and then now I'm at Texas A&M University. As Maureen said, I'm in the Department of Ecology and Conservation Biology. We're a new department. We used to be Wildlife and Fisheries Sciences, so you might be more familiar with that term. But we just had a little reorganization, and this is our brand new name as of this year, so super new. All right, and I'll be talking about some of the work that I'm doing here at Texas A&M. I've been here for the past 4 years now. All right, so today I want to talk about birds as sentinels of environmental health. And we've used birds like this throughout history. So a really good example of this is, of course, the canary in the coal mine. So as you're probably familiar with this story, miners brought canaries down into the mines with them to monitor carbon monoxide levels. So when birds started freaking out and then they died, they knew that the carbon monoxide levels were getting high enough that they were going to be toxic to humans soon. So it gave a warning to the miners to get out of the mines before they also succumbed to the carbon monoxide levels. So when we talk about sentinels of environmental health, we sometimes use the term bioindicators, right? And let me see if I can get my little pointer. I don't know if the pointer works well. Let's try the pen. Right, so bioindicators. And this term bioindicators means that these factors are used to assess, so usually it's a species, I'll say species. Species are used to assess the quality of the environment and how it changes over time. So in the canary example here, the canaries were used to assess carbon monoxide levels and how that was changing over time in the mine. And we can take that idea of having a species that's used to indicate something about the environment, and we can apply that to a broader scale. So we can use it to look at how ecosystems are changing or how broader environments are changing. Okay, so why are birds good sentinels of environmental health? Why do I choose to study birds for this? Well, one reason is that they have really high metabolism. So this high metabolism compared to mammals causes the effects of environmental problems to manifest more quickly in birds than mammals. So just like with the canary example, that canary showed the effects of carbon monoxide much more quickly than humans show it, or than another mammal would have shown it. If they'd taken pigs down or something, it wouldn't have worked as well. And that's because birds have that higher metabolism, they have a higher respiration rate, and it just causes effects of environmental contaminants to show up more quickly. Birds are also really conspicuous. They're easy to see, they're easy to notice, relatively easy to monitor compared to some other things, compared to maybe rodents that are, living underground. That's a lot harder to monitor than a bird. Public and private agencies also have a really long history of monitoring birds. So we have a large data set that's historical that we can look back on to look at trends over time. And there's also a lot of amateur and professional bird watchers, especially in our country. So these are popular birds. It's relatively easy to get citizen scientists involved and help us to collect data. All right, so what can birds tell us about environmental health? Well, at the broadest scale, birds can tell us that something's wrong, right? So if we notice that fecundity is going down, they're not producing as many chicks or eggs, maybe there's not as many nests, or we start to notice dead birds, or that there aren't as many birds in the area, so maybe they're leaving the area, that can tell us that something has changed in the environment and that change might not be good. It can't tell us for sure if that change isn't good, but it gives us a good inkling that this is probably not a good thing that's happening. All right, so a really good example of that is DDT and bald eagles. And I'm sure you're all familiar with this story, but bald eagles began to decline in the 1940s. And that was when DDT was being used widely as an insecticide, especially for mosquitoes. So at the time, of course, they didn't know that DDT was causing a problem for birds, especially for birds like bald eagles, for raptors. And it was unknown what was causing the decline, right? So we noticed that bald eagles were declining, and this was concerning. And so they started conducting controlled experiments to figure out what was going on and what was causing this decline. So those controlled studies then narrowed down the problem to a specific effect. So they found out that DDT was causing egg thinning. All right, and then Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring, which is pictured here, that was published in 1962, and it really brought this problem to the attention of the public and to the attention of policymakers. And about a decade later, DDT was finally banned. All right, so the bald eagles in this case were indicators that something was going on in the environment. And of course, DDT was not only bad for bald eagles, it was also causing problems for other birds and for other species, and potentially for humans as well. And so here we have bald eagles as an indicator species that something is wrong in the environment, and then further investigations narrowed down to what was actually going on and what was the problem here. So the problem here was DDT. Okay, so that was our brief intro into how we use birds as ecological sentinels. And now I'm going to start talking about three of my studies that are going on in this area. Okay, so the first of these studies looks at the effects of Hurricane Harvey on bird body condition, abundance, and diversity. And this is being led by one of my graduate students, a PhD student, Michael McCloy. He's also a really avid birder and used to work for the Bird Conservancy before he joined my lab. And he's conducting most of the work down at the Welder Wildlife Refuge. So you can see it pictured here. And this is in the Corpus Christi area, if you don't know where it is. And they're also funding some of this work. So I want to mention that. All right, so when we talk about hurricanes, the one we're really interested in is Hurricane Harvey, the most recent hurricane. And here, let me see if my laser pointer will work. Sometimes it's not so great, but we'll try this. So here in green, this green star is the Welder Wildlife Refuge. So this is where we were conducting the study. And this, the path that has the dots, this is the path of Hurricane Harvey. So as you might remember, it came in around Corpus Christi, went up towards San Antonio, then backed out into the Gulf, back past Houston, and moved very slowly over to Louisiana. So the Welder Wildlife Refuge was very close to where the hurricane first made its landing near Corpus Christi. And as you probably remember, Hurricane Harvey brought with it really high winds, extended periods of rain, caused a lot of flooding, and that of course damaged cities and human habitats, and it also damaged wildlife habitats. So the Welder Wildlife Refuge, where we were conducting the research, experienced a lot of flooding. There's a river that flows through it. That flooded and a lot of destruction of habitat in terms of trees being downed and other habitat getting destroyed for birds. There we go. Okay. So after a disaster like this, it's really common to count dead birds. That's usually what we do. We go out and see how many birds we find that have died. But sublethal effects are a lot harder to quantify, and they're important too, because sublethal effects can lead to long-term changes in population sizes because they can decrease fecundity or they can increase mortality. All right, so here we were really interested in those sublethal effects of Hurricane Harvey. And especially we wanted to know whether Hurricane Harvey affected the body condition of birds. And if so, which species of birds or which foraging guilds of birds were more strongly affected. All right, so we collected data during the breeding seasons from 2007 to 2018 for this study. And remember, Hurricane Harvey hit in 2017. So we also collected data for 1 year after Hurricane Harvey. And the data was collected during the breeding season. So we didn't get data on the birds right when Hurricane Harvey hit, because it hit right after the breeding season. So our relevant year here is actually 2018, which is the year following Hurricane Harvey. And we collected data using MAPS banding stations. So this is one of those citizen science projects that I'll be talking about later. And some of you might be familiar with this. But the MAPS banding stations are run by volunteers. And if you're a master bander, you can set up one of these stations. We just had one get set up in College Station, actually. And these are usually long-term stations, so they're intended to be run for multiple years. And this one has been run, as I said, from 2007 to 2018. Okay, and here's some of the data that we got. So we did find a negative impact of Hurricane Harvey on northern cardinal and white-eyed vireo body condition. So here we have years on the, let me grab, I think it's a little better when I do the pen. Okay, so here we have year on the x-axis, and on this axis is our body condition. So this is mass, bird mass scaled to bird size. So you can think about this as bird BMI or bird body mass index. All right, and so we go from 2007 all the way up to 2018. And as I said, 2017 is when we got the hurricane, right? So this was when Hurricane Harvey hit. But remember, we collected data before Hurricane Harvey hit. So this was just a normal year, even though body condition was a little bit higher this year. And then this was 2018. So this was the year after Hurricane Harvey. And you can see there was a huge decrease in body condition for northern cardinals. We saw a similar trend with white-eyed vireos. It just wasn't quite as drastic as this, but they also had a pretty strong decrease in body condition. And we saw the same thing for seed eaters as a whole. So when you look at birds that primarily eat seeds, this is generally what we saw, that following Hurricane Harvey, we saw a decrease in body condition. However, when we looked at the painted bunting, we saw no impact of Hurricane Harvey on painted bunting body condition. All right, so here again, we have Hurricane Harvey in 2017, doesn't look any different. And then 2018 comes, really doesn't look any different compared to, let's compare it to 2016. There's really no difference here. So generally painted buntings look like they're declining a little bit in body condition over time, but the hurricane doesn't seem like it had any impact on them. Okay, so from this study, we found that hurricanes negatively impact body condition for some birds. So we saw that northern cardinals, white-eyed vireos, and seed eaters in general seem to be negatively impacted by Hurricane Harvey. However, we saw that painted buntings were not affected by the hurricane. And painted buntings are migratory, whereas northern cardinals are resident species. So that may be the difference here. And it may be that resident species are more strongly affected, which would make sense because the painted buntings, the hurricane came and very quickly they were going off on migration, not hanging out in this habitat that was degraded. But northern cardinals had to stay in this habitat and live in this degraded habitat. So you would expect stronger effects of things like hurricanes on your resident species. All right, and that poor body condition could lead to poor survival and fecundity. We have not shown that yet, but we are in the process of trying to figure out how to check that and see if we have the data to actually do that. What we are definitely looking at next is looking at bird abundance and densities to get at resilience of the community. So to see if we saw any change in abundance and density of birds following the hurricane, and then continuing to monitor this place and continuing to look at the Walder Wildlife Refuge into the future and see how long it takes for the community to come back to its pre-hurricane levels. Okay, so that was just the first study that we're working on. The next one I wanted to talk about is a study that focuses on collecting baseline data on avian health. So this study, we're conducting it all across Texas, and we're trying to get baseline health data to compare to, so that if a disaster occurs, we're able to have baseline health data to then compare stress-induced or disturbed health data to. So in the case of the Walder Wildlife Refuge, that previous study that I was talking about, we had this really nice long-term data set of mass and size of birds, right? And that was really nice because then when a hurricane occurred, we already had this baseline data we could go back and refer to. But those types of data sets are pretty rare. It's pretty rare that you have something like that where you're tracking any measures long-term in birds. So in terms of health, we actually don't have a lot of baseline data available. So for wild birds, in many cases, we don't know what normal levels of baseline health data are. And when I talk about baseline health data, I'm especially talking about measures that like vets would use in order to see if a pet bird was sick, or that even your doctor might use to be able to tell if you're sick. So they're blood-based measures. And in many cases, we only know what's normal for a pet, and that's very different probably from what's normal for a wild bird. Or we don't know what's normal at all. We only know what happens when something bad happens. We take some blood samples from birds after something bad happens, and then we know what their levels are, but we don't know what they were before that bad thing happened, right? So in this study, I'm collaborating with, this is just to show you some of my collaborators. I'm collaborating with a veterinarian, Jill Heatley at Texas A&M, with Gary Volker, who's an ornithologist at Texas A&M as well. And the students involved in this project are Viridiana Martinez and Katrina Keith, who've been out collecting most of these samples. And here we're really targeting our resident birds, the birds that stick around, and the birds that we can catch a lot of. So that tends to be birds like northern cardinals and mockingbirds. And I'll show you a list of all the birds that we have in the study in a second. All right, so this is just to show you our sampling locations. So you can see they're pretty spread out. We have not gotten, well, actually we do have some samples from West Texas. That's not on this map. But our goal here was to try to get samples from birds that were closer to urban centers and also further from urban centers. So we have some samples that are very close to Houston and Austin, and then we have some like in between Austin and San Antonio. Then we also have a field site down south below San Antonio. And we collected baseline health sampling or baseline health measures in all 4 seasons. And the goal here was to see if these health measures change throughout the year. So is it enough to go out and collect baseline health measures once? Can you just go in the summer, get a whole bunch of baseline health measures, or do you have to go throughout the year and get samples from winter and summer, which is what you need to do if they're changing throughout the year? And we sampled a whole bunch of species. So the ones that we had enough to actually analyze, we've got northern cardinals, Carolina wrens, white-eyed vireos, Carolina chickadees, painted buntings, flycatchers, olive sparrows. You can see the rest of them. We even have a couple of northern flickers in there too. All right, to jump into the data, at this point, what we've been looking a lot at is seasonality. So do these health measures change across seasons? And what we found is probably unsurprisingly, yes, they do change across seasons, especially in winter. So in winter is when we see a lot of these changes. So this is body condition, and we've got summer and winter. And in winter, you can see that body condition decreases. So there's a decrease in body condition in winter. Not super surprising, right? We know that winter is a tough time for birds. And it shows up in their body condition that they tend to have decreased mass for their size. All right, and we also saw that sodium and chlorine decreased in winter. Let's see, over here we've got sodium, and here we have chlorine, and sodium actually started to decrease in fall, and then really decreased in winter significantly. And the same for sodium, you started to see a decrease in, or for chlorine rather, a decrease in fall, and then it really decreased come winter. All right, and these concentrations, we can speculate about what's causing it. It probably has to do with food availability. But the most important thing for our study is that it's changing across the season. So winter is different from summer and fall. Right, and we also looked at glucose. We looked at a bunch of other measures I'm not going to talk about. The trend was all kind of the same, that winter was different from summer and fall for many of these health measures. So here we have glucose, and we see that in winter, birds have higher glucose levels than they do in summer and fall. And this probably reflects a diet shift, maybe changing to higher carbohydrate food. Maybe thinking back to Scott's talk made me think about how they're metabolizing protein differently in fall. And maybe that's playing into why we're seeing higher glucose levels in winter. But again, the really important thing here is that in winter, it's different from summer and fall. And we also looked at if there were site differences. So if the birds that were sampled up by Houston were similar to the birds that were sampled down around San Antonio. And at this point, we don't see any difference based on site. So it doesn't matter where the birds are located in Texas, we see these same trends in terms of seasonality. Okay, so again, the important thing here was that our health measures were changing throughout the year. So that's really important to know because if a disaster occurs, we want appropriate baseline health data to compare to post-disaster health data, right? So if a disaster occurs in winter, we want to have baseline health data from the winter to then compare to that post-disaster health data. Or if it occurs in summer, we want that baseline health data from the summer, right? It wouldn't be appropriate to compare baseline health data from the summer to when a disaster occurs in the winter. We're already expecting a change to occur between seasons. All right, and as I mentioned earlier, usually after a disaster occurs, we take a lot of health data from birds. So for instance, with the Deepwater Horizon oil spill or after Hurricane Harvey, we go out, we take a lot of samples from birds to try to see what their health is like. But without this baseline health data, we can't actually tell if they're in poor health or in good health because we have nothing to compare it to. So after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, we actually realized this was a big problem. not just in terms of health data, but in terms of basic population monitoring. And that was what prompted the forming of the Gulf of Mexico Avian Monitoring Network. There we go, Gulf of Mexico Avian Monitoring Network. And I'm involved in this in the avian health realm. And this network really, its goal is to sync up monitoring networks all along the Gulf of Mexico so that when a disaster occurs, we have data that we can compare. So before Deepwater Horizon oil spill, there's a lot of monitoring going on with birds, but it's very hard to let those monitoring schemes crosstalk. So they're being conducted differently, and that makes it hard for us to compare the data. So our goal is to try to sync up all that monitoring, get the monitoring professionals to talk to each other, get the researchers to talk to each other. And our personal goal for the Avian Health Working Group is to try to get a repository for avian health data in the Gulf so that when a disaster occurs, we can have this publicly accessible repository of data that we can compare our post-disaster health measures to. Okay, and that brings me to my third little study I want to talk about. And this is one that we are just starting this summer. We're excited we finally got some funding to get started on this. And this is in collaboration with Susan Heath at the Gulf Coast Bird Observatory. And the goal of this study is to investigate plumage abnormalities in black skimmers and try to figure out what is causing these abnormalities that we've been seeing. And this is in the upper and central Texas coast, so in Galveston Bay area and also in Matagorda Bay. All right, so this just shows you the abnormalities. So the condition is found in chicks just before fledging. So that's when we go out to try to band these chicks, and that's when we actually notice that these abnormalities are happening. And it's an abnormality of feather growth in the primaries. So this is the primary, so these are the wings, just to orient you to this picture, you probably know this. This is the wing of the almost fledging. And you can see that the feathers don't look right. So the feathers are very fluffy, they're twisted left and right. At this point, this bird is almost going to fledge. These feathers should be really smooth. But instead, what we see is they're all twisted. They're different lengths, which is not what you should see. They're broken on the ends. And this is the same bird over time. So here's the bird on 8/13 in 2018. 2 weeks later in 8/28, you can see it's now missing chunks. So some of these feathers have fallen off and are starting to regrow again. And then this is the same bird again about 2 weeks later. And again, we've had some feathers twist off. So these are those long feathers from up here have now twisted and fallen off, and it's trying to regrow them again. All right, and this anomaly seems to be fatal. So in the wild, these chicks will continue to be fed by their parents until the breeding season's over. Then the parents are going to move on, and the chicks can't fly. When they have feathers like that, they cannot fledge. And they'll stay on the colony and they'll starve to death because they can't get food. And regardless of whether they are fed or not, they do seem to die. So Susan took some of the chicks off the island. So there were 4 affected chicks that she took off the islands and sent them to rehab professionals. And 2 of those also went to Waco Zoo. And the chicks had really good appetites. They fed them fish and mice. They ate really well. They gained weight. The primaries continued to grow in just like that. So they would grow in, then they'd twist and they would fall off. And that just kept happening. And after about a month, the birds died. So all 4 of those birds died in about a month, regardless of, they were being fed really well. So it was not a diet issue. And this was first noted in 2018. It wasn't seen in 2019, and then it occurred again in 2020. So after it occurred again, we started thinking this is something we should probably be looking into. All right, so the goal of this project is to figure out what's going on. And unfortunately, I don't have an answer for you yet. This is our first summer of actually collecting samples from these birds. So we'll be going down in June to get samples from healthy birds. And hopefully, if there are any affected birds, we'll also take samples from those birds and try to figure out what's happening here. Our guesses is that it could be a toxin or a contaminant in the environment. It could also be a bacteria or maybe a virus. And of course, if it's a toxin, that would be very concerning. It'd be concerning, or a bacteria or a virus, really concerning for other birds. But a toxin is extra concerning, especially for humans in the area. So in this case, the skimmers may be bioindicators of something going on in the environment that could be affecting human health, although again, we don't know that yet. But these are areas that are frequented, they're used heavily by humans, so it would be important to know. And as you guys know, of course, skimmers are water birds, and water birds are especially sensitive to environmental contaminants. And that's because contaminants are usually water soluble, and they also accumulate in runoff from agriculture and industry. And the Texas coast is getting more and more populated. It's also used heavily by industry, of course, and all of those things kind of spew contaminants into the coast. So it's really important to be monitoring these water birds, to be looking for effects of contaminants, but also of bacteria, which is also becoming a major problem along the coast, or potentially viruses, right? Pandemic, if COVID-19 taught us anything, it's that viruses are also super important. Of course, we knew viruses were important, but viruses can have huge impacts. Okay, so that wraps it up for the studies I wanted to share with you guys. I don't see anything yet in the chat. Remember, if you have any questions that pop into your head, feel free to ask in the chat. But we will have plenty of time at the end. So the last thing I just wanted to talk with you guys about a little bit was citizen science opportunities. So there are a lot of citizen science opportunities involving birds, and they're really useful for scientists. So this data, we're really in a heyday right now of citizen science data, and there are just tons of studies being published using these data sets. And this is not a comprehensive list of citizen science opportunities. These are just some of the ones that I pulled up. If just a quick Google search, you can find more. But the Christmas bird count, I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll also talk about Project Feeder Watch, Nest Watch, and the Breeding Bird Survey. I mentioned earlier about maps banding stations. So these are really awesome repositories of data for us. I mean, they're usually long-term, and we get a lot of information about the birds because the birds are banded. So you get resite information. We also take body measures and take mass of the birds. And they're really fun to help out with too. They usually do require more training, but a lot of them need volunteers, and they're a great opportunity to learn about how to band. And you can look up online where the map stations are in your area, and then just contact them to see if you can help out. Sometimes you have to go through a formal training. It depends on the map station, how they do that. There's also Great Backyard Bird Count, eBird, of course, all of you know eBird. Celebrate Urban Birds and Master Naturalist. These are just a few of the many different citizen science opportunities for birds. All right, just wanted to highlight a few of these. So the first of these is the Audubon Christmas Bird Count. You guys are birders. I'm sure you know about the Audubon Christmas Bird Count, but it is the most extensive, longest term, continuous, and most geographically comprehensive data set in American ornithology. So this is a really impressive project. It was started in 1900, so it's been going on for 121 years. And if you haven't participated in it, it is a one-day thing. So you go out and usually sign up through your local Audubon Society. And the local Audubon Society will divide up their area into circles that don't overlap. And then you're responsible with a group to survey that circle within the day. And it has to happen in the same day within this window around Christmas. So you go out and do a comprehensive survey of every single bird that you see. So every single bird gets counted. And when you compile all that together, it gives you a really good picture of where birds are and how many birds are there. So of density and abundances of birds and where they're located on the landscape. So The Christmas bird count has been used in at least 300 studies. And I think, I was Googling this, I think it's more like 400 studies at this point. It's been used in a ton of studies. These are just a couple that I pulled that had ties to avian health. So here we have one about long-term changes in abundance and diversity of waterfowl populations in relation to water quality. Another one about wintering raptor abundance and interpreting population trends and species abundance distributions. I've also found papers on effects of West Nile virus on sensitive species, range expansions, distribution and abundance patterns, long-term population trends, hurricane effects, all sorts of things that you can get from these Christmas bird counts, especially long-term population trends. It's really important for that. The next one I wanted to talk a little bit about is Nest Watch. I really love Nest Watch. I think it's super cool. So this turns you guys into nest monitors. So you go out into your backyard and you monitor the nests. You do have to take a little quiz to make sure you can identify birds and you can identify nests and eggs. And then you submit your data. And this one, I believe, is run through Cornell, if I'm remembering correctly. Many of these are run through the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And this is a really great one because fecundity, so looking at how many eggs birds are producing and how many chicks they're producing, is really a really important measure for population health. But it's also really difficult to calculate for species on a large scale. So if an individual scientist is trying to do this, they have to go out to all these different field sites to monitor these nests like every day. And it takes a ton of effort, a ton of time, and a lot of money. You have to pay for field assistants to do this. So getting citizens to monitor these nests is a really great way to increase sample sizes and to get a really broad geographical range for these nests. And it's really useful for birds like bluebirds that are easily accessible where people put up boxes, or for other, really common backyard birds. All right, here's another one out of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. This is Project Feeder Watch. So this one, I think it only happens in the winter, but this is where you monitor your bird feeders. And someone can correct me if it goes on all year. They might just be advertising the winter part of it right now. But yeah, so basically you just watch your bird feeders and then report what birds come to your bird feeders. And it can give scientists a lot of data. So it gives them trends in bird distribution and abundance, environmental factors that attract birds, the timing and extent of winter eruption. So I'm sure you guys are familiar with the pine siskin eruption. And this can provide information on how far and how wide that pine siskin eruption was happening. And also how disease is spread among feeder birds. So house finch eye disease is one of the things that this project has been tracking. And it's tracked it since I think the outbreak was like 1994 or something when this occurred. So it's been tracking it for, about almost 20 years now. And has been able to monitor the spread of the finch eye disease. And it has dropped down again. So it's been looking at the coevolution between the house finches and bacteria that causes the house finch eye disease. And has been able to provide data back to people back to the citizens about how this disease is spreading in the environment. All right, and the last one I'll mention, again, this is not comprehensive at all, but the last one is the North American Breeding Bird Survey. So this is a pretty rigorous citizen science activity. There's a number of requirements for participation. The really important one here is you have to have the ability to identify breeding birds in the area by sight and sound. So sound being the tricky one, of course. So this is counting breeding birds, and a lot of the breeding birds that they count are singing males. So you have to be able to identify songs, birds by song. And you also have to complete a training program through BBS. But because this one is really rigorous, it's super useful data. And we're using this to look at the effects of hurricanes on birds at a larger scale. And it's been used by other people to look at the effects of disturbances and to look at long-term population trends over time. And you can combine this with kind of broader scale like eBird data, where there's a lot more, and combining these different levels of rigor can help to give you a better picture of what's going on. All right, so these citizen science projects are really important because we know that birds are not doing super hot. So we've lost 2.9 billion birds since 1970. I'm sure you guys have seen this graphic. And so monitoring these long-term population trends is really important. So this actual study was published in Science in 2019, and it used citizen science data to discover that long-term declining trend. So the citizen science data was really important here. And just the top 3 that they mentioned that they used were North American Breeding Bird Survey, that's the one I just talked about, and the Audubon Christmas Bird Count. So they used citizen science data and a number of other smaller scale ones focused on more individual species to be able to identify this long-term trend. So citizen science is really important for being able to see these large geographic population-wide trends. Okay, well, that is all I had. So I'm happy to take questions. And I also just, of course, want to thank my funders, the students involved, and the collaborators involved in these projects. Yes, that's a tricky question. So there, in terms of the skimmers specifically, we don't know if the plumage abnormalities we're seeing could be related to that. It could be. We are still seeing effects of the Deepwater Horizon spill on birds. And yes, the stuff they used to clean it up also had some detrimental effects on birds, but I would say, I think the oiling had stronger detrimental effects than the stuff used to clean it up. So it was a balancing act of what you can do. I'm not sure specifically about effects that it had on birds. I'd have to check. Yeah, so I'm not sure exactly if what type of effects the coagulants had that they used.
All right, Jackie, thank you so much. I think that's all we have from here. Everybody give Dr. Grace a big round of applause. And you've got a good crowd here. I know you weren't on when Dr. McWilliams started, but you've got some good number of folks here as well as what you've got online. So everybody enjoyed your talk very much. And thank you again so much for joining us.
Great. Well, thanks for having me.